So this is about literary analysis. We're going to look at some things to help organize your thoughts, some pre-writing activities to help get your thoughts together before you start writing your paper. We'll talk about forming a thesis statement and organizing points and evidence in your essay. So let's get started. So an analysis, and you'll see me reference this book a few times. It's a recommended text. It's a writer's handbook, a writer's reference. An analysis allows you to examine the parts of a text, understand what it means, and how it makes its meaning. Your goal is to offer your judgment of the text and persuade readers to see it through your analytical perspective. So basically, we're just looking at the parts of the story and how they add up to the whole. So we want to first identify what is the whole, what is the main point or intention of the story, what's the argument that the story is making, and then how does the author support her argument in the story? How does she build it and develop it? So you can see here from this handy-dandy graphic, we will be breaking down the parts to understand how the whole works. And we're also going to be making some judgment in an analysis. Is it effective? Is the argument solid? How does this differ from a summary? And keep in mind, a summary tells us what happens, but an analysis shows us how it happens. Your reader for this paper is already familiar with the story. They've read it. So you don't have to spend a lot of time summarizing. You will need to present a little bit of summary anytime you bring up like a quote. You might have to give a couple sentences of background information about what's happening in the time of the story or in the time of the quote. That way your reader is reminded of the specifics involved with the quote. So usually a couple sentences before the quote will help remind them. But you don't have to give a whole bunch of summary in this paper. Again, we're trying to show the reader how the story achieves its intention or argument, not what it's arguing necessarily. So why do we do this? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all is we're practicing analysis of implicit arguments. So an implicit argument is one that doesn't state its point or its thesis directly and explicitly. Like, I think this is the way the world should be, or I think this is what's wrong with the world. An implicit argument, as what we're seeing in the short stories that we've been reading, is something that we have to piece together based on all of the evidence that we're seeing. So practice in analyzing implicit arguments can be valuable because we learn to look more deeply into something we're witnessing. And rather than just go by our gut, which is often informed by our biases, we are picking it apart a little bit, using some specific strategies to do so and to first identify the argument that the implicit thing is making, and then kind of breaking it down and tearing it apart to judge it. Secondly, and I think this is probably even more important, is that spending time analyzing literature helps us be more human. Last week in the overview, you might have seen the link to the article about how reading literary fiction leads to a greater understanding of empathy in the reader, and studies have confirmed that. So I think analyzing short fiction gives us some time to think about what it means to be human, and that's a good thing, because we really don't spend enough time, in my opinion, thinking about that, because we're surrounded by such a fast-paced world. It's easy to get caught up in everything else and forget what it means to be a person. So some pre-writing strategies we're going to take a look at. First, I'd recommend choosing a story that you feel strongly about. Not one that you just think will be easy to break down and analyze, but one that you're genuinely curious about. It's going to be easier for you to write, I think, and it's going to be more rewarding for the reader, because we might get that sense of discovery along with you as you've looked into something that you care about. You want to reread the text for sure. That's probably the best thing you can do to prepare for this paper, is reread the story that you choose. And again, you can choose any of the stories that we've read from the collection, and annotate. Now that you've read it one time, I think the annotation will be even easier I would specifically look for themes that are bubbling up, that come up over and over. The second time you read something, you're going to notice a lot of things you didn't the first time. You're going to notice the author at work, foreshadowing the things that happen later. And if the foreshadowing was effective, the first time you read it, you probably didn't notice it. Good foreshadowing will subtly prepare the reader for what happens later in the story, so that when it does happen, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It feels like the story has earned that thing. So reread the story and look for the author at work building her argument. Challenge some of the things the author says. Is this true, or would this really happen? Or confirm things that you think are good examples or strong pieces of the story. Yeah, okay, I think this is a real human emotion, or I can imagine this is really what a person would feel like in this situation. Those agreements and disagreements will help with your evaluation, your judgment of the story, and its overall effectiveness that's going to go into your paper. You might also think about outlining the narrative arc of the story. That way you can kind of see the author at work again. So what is the conflict? What are the forces at work against each other? How do those forces rub up against each other and create tension for the reader? Where's the climax? Where's the turning point where one of those forces overtakes the others? And then what is the resolution? What happened as a result of that force overtaking the other forces at work in the climax or in the conflict? So let's think about forming our thesis statement, and keep in mind thesis statement is just a fancy word for basically the point that's being made. So what's your point in the paper? But first we have to identify what is the point of the story, because your point in the paper is your identification of the author's argument and your evaluation as well. So let's take a look. So a couple ways to identify what the author is arguing in the story. And again, just think about what point is it making? What point is she making in this story? One way is to break the thesis into two parts. So what is the story about, and what is the author saying about it? So the topic, the what, and the central idea, what about it? And keep in mind that most literary fiction is making some kind of argument about what it means to be human, or something about our society. So an example might be in the story Our Lady of Peace. The topic that might be standing out to me would be the education system. So that's the topic of the story. Now, what is Packer saying about it? What's her point about the education system? Well, I could say that she's arguing that the education system is flawed and ... I'll leave that up to you, since that's kind of your job. But think about what's one of the topics in the story, and what is the point being made about it. Now, keep in mind that though a short story is usually singular in its intention, is usually making one argument, the argument that is being made is arguable, basically. So there's more than one argument being made, and it's up to you to decide what you think is that main argument. So, your identification of the story's thesis might be different from what somebody identifies as its thesis, but that doesn't mean that one of you is wrong necessarily. As long as you can support your analysis, your identification of what the author is arguing with evidence from the text, and the text does not easily disprove what you're trying to argue or point out as being the point of the story, then you're probably okay. So again, a good identification of the author's thesis will be something that can be supported by the text and something that cannot be disproven by other parts of the text. Another way to identify a story's thesis is to maybe first identify the question that you think the author is trying to answer in the story, because sometimes it's easier for us to imagine the question than it is the point. So, for example, I might say, what is ZZ Packer arguing about the education system in Our Lady of Peace? Okay, now I've identified a question. Let me think. What would she say is the answer to that? Well, she is saying that the education system is ... So another way to approach identifying a thesis statement or a main point or argument that's being made in an implicit argument is maybe first identify the question and then the answer to that question. Keep in mind that your thesis in your paper is not the same thesis as the story. That's going to be part of your thesis because, again, you have to identify what the author is arguing in this. But it also needs to make a little bit of a judgment. Is it successful? Is it unsuccessful? Is it a little bit of both? Does she do one thing well, but maybe could do another thing better? So you do need to include some judgment. And keep in mind, I'll post a couple of sample essays next week. So if you kind of want to see what one of these essays look like, you can take a look at those. So some other ways to think about judgment, kind of assessing how strong the author's argument is. Is there anything that the author has overlooked or failed to consider? That might be a flaw in the development of her argument in the story. Why might a reasonable person draw a different set of conclusions about the subject matter? Maybe you think she's off the mark in what she's saying about the education system. How does the text complicate or clarify something else you've been thinking of or reading about? So is it confirming some things that you've seen in your own life or in the world around you? If so, that's probably a strength. So look for ways that it might be missing the mark, as well as some ways that it's hitting the mark. Keep in mind that a successful thesis is nice and specific, usually 1 or 2 sentences at the end of your introduction, and it's kind of a forecast for your readers. This is what I'm going to be proving throughout the body of my essay. I'm going to show you why ZZ Packer, or how ZZ Packer is developing her argument about the education system, and I'm going to show why it's successful or why it's unsuccessful, or the degree to which it's a little bit of both. Keep in mind, it's not a description of a story. It needs to be something contestable. So in other words, Our Lady of Peace is a story about the education system, is not something anybody would argue about, right? Everybody would say, yeah, to some degree, it's about the educational system. So it shouldn't just be describing what the story's about. It should be making a point about the story. So here's an example. Let's say I'm interested in how there's a cycle of hatred in the story Brownies. So that's the what. And what do I think Packer is saying about it? So the what is the cycle of hatred. What about it? Well, I'd say that she's saying the cycle of hatred is powerful, but not unbreakable. Now I might want to think about, how does she show this? I might identify a couple ways that she does. So I would say maybe she does it through a thematic examination of the roots of misunderstanding. So how misunderstanding keeps coming up as a theme, and also how she uses symbolism to develop her argument that the cycle of hatred is powerful but not unbreakable. And then I might need to add in a little bit of judgment. So I've identified 2 ways that she supports her and develops her argument. One is her examination of the roots of misunderstanding. So maybe I think that she does a good job of examining that, how misunderstanding occurs and how it's perpetuated. So I might say that that's done successfully. But maybe I say that her use of symbolism is not as successful as it could be because she misses some opportunities, or it's heavy-handed, or something along those lines. So my thesis eventually could look something like this. In the short story Brownies, ZZ Packer successfully shows how powerful the cycle of hatred is by examining the roots of misunderstanding. However, her use of symbolism to show that this cycle is unbreakable is ... So you can see here I've kind of noted some strengths and some weaknesses in 2 ways that she develops her argument. And I've identified what her argument is that the cycle of hatred is powerful but not unbreakable. So to prove